Catherine Hartley sat very still on the edge of the vast bed, as if any movement might break her in two. The bedchamber at Thornwick Manor glowed with candlelight, soft and unsteady, throwing long shadows across carved oak and heavy drapes. Outside, the wind worried the bare branches and made the windowpanes murmur, while inside the air smelled of beeswax and lavender and something sharper, fear. Her hands were clasped in her lap, knuckles pale, the wedding ring cold against her skin. She had waited 3 weeks to become a wife in truth, 3 weeks of polite conversation and careful distance, of strangers learning each other's voices while society cheered and servants bowed, and now there was nowhere left to hide. When the door opened and the Duke of Thornwick stepped in, tall and dark against the light, Catherine forced herself to speak before courage left her entirely. "I'm not a virgin," she whispered. The words hung between them like a confession in church. Adrian Blackwood did not flinch. He only closed the door quietly and said, in a voice that made her blood run cold, "I know, Catherine. I was there." For a moment, she did not understand what he meant, her mind trying to reject the sentence, to push it away as impossible. "There," she echoed, and the word came out thin. You cannot mean," she swallowed hard, her throat aching as if she had been crying for hours, though she had not shed a tear yet. "That was 10 years ago." Adrian crossed the room with measured steps, not rushing her, not looming, yet somehow the space belonged to him. He had that kind of presence, the kind she had noticed the first day they met at Lord Ashford's house party, a man used to being obeyed but not careless with power. He stopped at a polite distance, his hands loose at his sides, his expression unreadable in the candlelight. "You have been trembling since we came upstairs," he said quietly. "I thought it was fear of the night. Now I know it was fear of the truth." Catherine's cheeks burned as shame rose up fast, familiar as a second heartbeat. She had promised herself she would not begin this marriage with a lie, promised herself she would face him like an honest woman even if honesty ruined her. "I had to tell you," she said, forcing the words out. Before you expected," she could not say the rest, the language too blunt for this room, for this moment. "I have carried it for so long. I could not bear to carry it into your bed as well." Adrian's gaze did not waver. "You thought I would cast you out. I thought you would despise me," she admitted. "Or pity me. Or," her voice cracked, "or believe I trapped you." He exhaled, slow and controlled. "Do you believe you trapped me, Catherine?" "No," the answer came quickly, "because that part was true. I agreed to marry you because you offered safety. Because my aunt urged it, and because I was tired of being a burden. But I did not," she stopped, "because the rest would sound like an insult." Adrian seemed to hear what she did not say anyway, his eyes softening while his jaw tightened as if he were bracing himself against old pain. "You are not a burden," he said. "That is kind," Catherine replied, bitterness slipping in despite her effort. "But kindness does not change what I am." "What you are," he said, "is my wife." The title felt heavy on her shoulders, wife, duchess, the words having sounded grand when the archbishop spoke them, but here feeling like a costume she did not know how to wear. "I was 17, she said suddenly, because she could not bear the silence. "It happened at Rosewood. During the midsummer servants' ball. I shouldn't have been there. I shouldn't have," she pressed her fingers to her temple, as if she could hold her thoughts in place. "It was dark. There were lanterns, but the garden was shadowed. I never saw his face clearly." She forced herself to meet Adrian's eyes. "How can you say you were there?" Adrian's expression changed at last, not shock, not anger, but something deeper, recognition and a strange kind of sorrow, as he took one step closer and then stopped again, as if offering her the chance to retreat. "Because I remember you," he said, his voice lowering, rough at the edges. "Because there are details no one else could know. Because I have lived with that night as you have, only from the other side of the darkness." Catherine stared at him, her mind flickering through memories she had tried to bury, the warm summer air, the music drifting across the lawn, the thrill of doing something improper for once, her heart pounding with reckless freedom, a man's hand steady at her waist guiding her through a dance she did not know she could follow, laughter, hers, unfamiliar and bright, then the garden, roses thick in the night, and a voice that made her feel seen. But that voice could not belong to a duke did not wander among servants, did not hide behind shadows and borrowed names. "You are trying to soothe me," she said, though her conviction faltered. "You are telling me what you think I want to hear. Or what you think will keep me from running from this marriage the moment it becomes real." Adrian's eye sharpened. "Do you want to run?" Catherine's hands tightened in her lap. "I want the truth. I have lived 10 years with one truth, that I made a foolish choice and paid for it. If there is another truth, if you are saying you are the man from that night, then everything I believed is wrong. My shame. My anger. My loneliness." Her voice shook harder now. "It cannot be you. I would have known. You did not know my face," he said gently. "And you would not have been looking for a duke." The words struck her, simple and cruel in their logic. Of course she would not have imagined nobility beneath those lanterns, would never connect the boy in the garden to the man before her now, polished by years and duty and wealth, and still disbelief clung to her. "Why would you be there?" Adrian glanced toward the hearth, where the last embers glowed low, and when he spoke again his voice sounded quieter, as if speaking to someone far away. 10 years ago, I was not the Duke of Thornwick." Catherine's stomach tightened as she waited, barely breathing. "I was a younger son," he continued. "A man with no title to inherit. No grand responsibility. Only the freedom to be foolish." Catherine's mind raced. Then he would have been 22 perhaps, older than she had been but not enough to make her feel like a child, and she remembered feeling equal that night, shockingly equal, like two souls meeting in secret rather than two ranks colliding. "But you are the Duke now," she whispered. "I became the Duke very suddenly," Adrian said, holding her gaze with no escape in his eyes. "And that suddenness is part of why I never came back to you." The room seemed to tilt, Catherine's mouth going dry, never came back, so he was not only claiming the night but the decade after it, the empty years, the waiting, the heartbreak that had eaten her alive. "So you admit you knew," she said sharply. "All this time, you knew who I was." "Yes." "And you married me anyway." "Yes." She rose from the bed, unable to sit or breathe properly, the nightgown too thin, the air too cold, pacing 2 steps before stopping with her hands pressed to her ribs as if holding her heart in place. "You looked at me," she said, her voice rising, "and you let me stand beside you at the altar while I believed I was confessing a secret you did not know. You listened to me speak vows while you kept this enormous thing hidden." Adrian did not deny it, which was almost worse. "I did not keep it hidden to punish you," he said carefully. "I kept it hidden because I did not know how to tell you without destroying what little peace you had found, and because I did not know if you would believe me." Catherine let out a laugh that was not laughter at all. "Believe you? I can scarcely believe you now." Adrian's face softened again, and for the first time she saw not just a duke but a man carrying something heavy as he stepped closer until she could see the faint line near his brow, the tiredness beneath his control. "Catherine," he said, her name sounding like a vow. "I have not forgotten you for a single day." She shook her head hard. "Stop. Do not speak as if this is romance. 10 years ago I thought I meant something to a stranger, then he vanished and I spent years wondering what I had done wrong." "I did wrong," Adrian said, the blunt honesty startling her. "I did more wrong than you know." Catherine's chest tightened until it hurt. "Then tell me," she demanded, hating how much she needed the answer. "Tell me how you could be there. Tell me who you were. Tell me why I never saw your face." Adrian was silent for a moment, the candles crackling as the wind pressed against the windows, then he said, "Sit down." Catherine bristled at the command but it was steady, grounding, and only then did she realize her legs were trembling as she lowered herself onto the edge of the chair by the hearth instead of the bed, refusing that intimacy until she understood what stood between them, while Adrian remained standing with his hands clasped behind his back like a man facing judgment. "That night," he began, "you believed you were dancing with an estate manager." Catherine's breath caught as the words unlocked a memory she had tried to blur, a name murmured in the dark, a laugh, a warm hand, Adrian Clark, or had her mind invented it afterward to give the stranger shape, as Adrian watched her face closely. "You never knew you were speaking to a Blackwood." "No," Catherine said faintly. "I never knew." "And I did not tell you," he admitted, "because for the first time in my life, someone spoke to me as if I were simply a man. Not a title, not a surname, not a future." The room spun again, but slower now, like a wheel turning into place. "So you used a false name?" "Yes." "And you let me believe," her voice broke before she forced it steady. "You let me believe you were someone you were not?" Adrian nodded once. "Yes." Catherine's hands clenched around the arms of the chair as anger surged, tangled with confusion, grief, and a faint, dangerous pull of recognition, while Adrian's voice softened. "Let me tell you about a boy who wasn't yet a duke." Catherine stared at him, her heart hammering as the night seemed suddenly larger than the bedchamber, larger than the manor itself, as if the past had stepped through the candlelight and demanded to be seen, and Adrian took a slow breath before the next words fell like the first stone in an avalanche. 10 years ago," he said, "I was someone else entirely." "You? At a servants' ball?" "Impossible." Catherine's disbelief filled the candlelit room, but Adrian did not look offended. If anything, he looked as if he had expected her to fight him on every detail, and was ready to meet her there with patience. He began slowly, as though laying each truth on the table where she could examine it. 10 years ago, in 1813, he was 22 and very much not the Duke of Thornwick. He was the second son of the previous duke, the spare rather than the heir, with an older brother, James, who wore the title and carried the family's pride as if it were stitched into his coat. Adrian had been raised with all the rules of rank, all the stiff manners, all the careful distances that kept noble blood from mixing too freely with common life, and yet he had always felt like a man watching his own life from behind a window. While James attended the right clubs and made the right alliances, Adrian grew restless. He wanted to understand what their wealth truly meant, not in speeches and ledgers, but in the real work that kept an estate alive, crops, tenants, repairs, rents, the quiet decisions that made a village thrive or fail. So, in a fit of stubborn independence that he now called foolish and honest at the same time, he convinced his brother to let him spend a season learning the estates in a way no one would expect of a gentleman. He went under a plain name, Adrian Clark, and he dressed not like a duke's brother, but like a capable steward or estate manager, the kind of man who could walk through a farmyard without being stared at. Rosewood Manor was one of the Blackwood holdings tied by old agreements, close enough to be important, distant enough that he could arrive without great attention. He lived among the practical rhythms of the place, early mornings, muddy boots, meetings with tenants, and long afternoons studying repairs in the roof or the accounts for the stable. For the first time, he was spoken to as a person with duties, not a symbol with privileges, and he found he liked it more than he expected. Then came the midsummer servants' ball, a tradition at Rosewood, held on the edge of the gardens where the lawn met the trees. It was meant for the household staff and tenant families, a rare night where music and lanterns turned work into celebration. A nobleman was not supposed to attend such a thing, not truly, not as a participant. They might pass by in polite approval, they might allow a barrel of ale, they might congratulate the cook, but they did not dance under the same strings of lights. Adrian told Catherine he had no excuse that sounded noble. He went because he wanted to. He went because he had spent weeks as a clerk and felt the temptation to see if he could fully step outside his rank for one night, just one. He went because he was tired of being watched and weighed and judged, and he wanted to disappear into a crowd that did not care who his father was. The night had been warm, the air full of summer roses and cut grass, and the music lively enough to make even the shyest maid clap along. Adrian described the scene with a clarity that made Catherine's skin prickle, as if his memory carried her back without permission, lanterns hanging from tree branches, ribbons tied to benches, the fiddler's bow moving fast, laughter rising like sparks. He moved through it easily, greeted by the servants who believed him to be what he pretended, exchanging ordinary words, accepting a cup of punch, smiling more freely than he ever did at a London ball. Then he noticed a figure in the garden shadows beyond the brightest circle of light, someone standing too still to be part of the crowd. At first he thought it was a footman watching for trouble, but then the figure shifted, and the hem of a fine dress caught the light, and he realized the watcher was not a servant at all. It was a young lady, half hidden by climbing roses, her posture careful, as if she knew she did not belong and yet could not make herself leave. Catherine listened, her breath shallow, because she remembered that moment, how she had slipped out of the house when everyone believed her safely upstairs, how loneliness had pressed on her that season after her mother's death, how the world of proper drawing-rooms had felt like a cage. She had heard the music from her window and followed it, drawn by something simple and human. She had told herself she only wished to watch, only to hear laughter that was not measured and polite. Adrian said he had watched her for a heartbeat and then made a decision that changed everything. He approached. Not like a duke's brother, not like a man asking permission, but like an equal offering a hand. He remembered her startled look, the way her eyes widened, then narrowed, as if she were weighing danger against desire. He remembered her saying, in a hushed voice, that she should not be there. He remembered his reply, soft and daring, then stay where no one will see you. He offered to dance, and she hesitated, and for a moment he thought she would run, but then she placed her hand in his. He told her he introduced himself as Adrian Clark, and she accepted it because why would she suspect a lie so grand? She thought him a steward, perhaps, or an estate man, educated enough to speak well, but not important enough to threaten her with gossip. He did not correct her. He admitted that plainly, without trying to dress it up. They danced where the lantern light was dimmer, near the edge of the crowd, and in that shared half-shadow something in Catherine loosened. She laughed, quiet at first, then real, and the sound surprised her as much as it did him. They spoke between dances, their words rushed and excited, as if they were trying to fit a lifetime into a single stolen evening, books, the feeling of being trapped by other people's expectations, the strange comfort of speaking without titles. Adrian told her he had never forgotten the way she listened, as if she was hungry for the world, nor the way she looked at him like he was simply a man with ideas. Catherine remembered, too, though she had tried not to, the warmth of the night, the thrill of being seen, the sense that she was not alone. Adrian admitted they drank too much punch, that they were young and giddy with freedom, and that neither of them was thinking of consequences because consequences belong to daylight, not to music and lanterns. He paused then, his eyes steady on hers, and his voice dropped to something almost tender and almost pained as he said, "We talked until midnight, Catherine, and then the noise of the lawn felt too crowded for what was happening between us." His mouth tightened as if remembering both sweetness and regret, and he finished quietly, "The gardens called to us." Adrian's eye stayed on Catherine's as he spoke, but his voice seemed to drift back 10 years, into that warm midnight when the music from the lawn faded behind them and the world narrowed to the garden path under their feet. The rose garden at Rosewood was not grand in the London sense, but it was alive, thick bushes heavy with bloom, stone borders warmed by the day, and a faint sweetness in the air that clung to skin and breath. Lanterns hung farther back near the dancers, so here the light came in soft patches, moonlight broken by leaves, shadows sliding over petals. Catherine had walked beside him with her heart beating too fast, half thrilled and half afraid, and Adrian admitted he felt the same. He told her he remembered how she stopped near an arch of climbing roses and tilted her face upward as if she were listening for something beyond the fiddles, and when he asked what she was thinking, she said she wondered if her life would ever feel like her own. That answer, he said, hit him harder than any flirtation, because it was honest, and because he had been carrying the same question. They spoke quietly, not like strangers trying to impress, but like two people who had been lonely in similar ways, Catherine with her grief and her strict household, Adrian with his rank and the constant pressure to behave like a Blackwood. They talked about books and places they wanted to see, about whether duty was a kind of prison or a kind of purpose, and Catherine surprised him with sharp questions and a fearless mind, the sort of mind that did not bow just because a rule existed. Adrian said that at some point, without either of them naming it, the air between them changed, the conversation slowed, their steps slowed, and their silences grew longer, full of meaning. He asked if she wanted to go back, and she did not answer at first. Instead, she looked at him in the dim light, trying to read a face she could not fully see, and she said, almost to herself, "I don't want to be afraid tonight." Adrian told Catherine, in the present, that he should have stopped then, that a decent man should have walked her back and let the night end as a memory of a dance and nothing more, but he was 22, she was 17, and both of them were dizzy with the feeling of being unseen by society's eyes. He asked for her permission, he said it plainly, he asked if he might kiss her, and Catherine gave a small nod that felt like stepping off a ledge. The first kiss was careful, uncertain, then deepened when she did not pull away. The roses around them seemed to hold the moment, as if the garden itself had leaned in close. Adrian's hands were gentle, and Catherine admitted she had wanted it, even as she feared it. She had been taught rules, but no one had taught her how to handle longing. He said they both confessed, in broken whispers, that neither had been with anyone before, and that fact made them more tender, not less. They moved like people learning, pausing to check, to breathe, to be sure, letting desire grow without turning cruel. Catherine listened with her cheeks burning as he described the softness of her voice when she said his name, his false name, and how it made him feel, for once, like he belonged to himself. He told her that in the darkness she never saw him clearly, not the shape of his jaw, not the exact set of his eyes, only flashes when moonlight shifted, and he did not correct her belief that he was an ordinary man because, in that moment, he wanted to be ordinary more than he had ever wanted anything. He said the night felt endless and brief at the same time, and when it was over they lay hidden among the scent of crushed petals and warm grass, listening to distant laughter as if it belonged to another life. Near dawn, reality returned in small, sharp pieces, the chill in the air, the pale edge of morning, the knowledge that Catherine had to slip back inside before anyone noticed. Adrian remembered standing with her at the garden's edge, her hair undone, blue ribbons loose, her expression bright and terrified all at once. He promised, "I'll find you tomorrow," and he meant it with his whole heart. He said he watched her disappear toward the house, then went back to his small room on the estate, unable to sleep, already planning how he would confess who he was, how he would ask properly for permission to court her, how he would make the next day the beginning of something honorable. Then, he told Catherine, the morning shattered those plans. A messenger arrived while the sun was still low, dust on his coat, panic in his eyes, and Adrian's brother James had been thrown from his horse in a riding accident and was dead, the words landing like a blow and turning Adrian's blood cold. Their father had died only months before, which meant James had barely settled into the dukedom before tragedy struck again, and now Adrian was no longer a younger son playing at being clerk. He was the Duke of Thornwick, and everything that title carried, debts, tenants, lawyers, parliament obligations, a grieving mother, a household suddenly looking to him for orders, crashed down at once. He was told he had to leave for London immediately, that he could not linger, could not risk scandal, could not explain himself to anyone at Rosewood until the family had arranged the first urgent matters. Adrian said he wanted to run to Catherine, wanted to leave a letter, wanted to send word through someone trustworthy, but the house was already in motion, servants packing, men waiting with horses, grief turning everyone hard and brisk. He left in a storm of duty and shock, telling himself it would be only a few days before he returned to finish what he had started. Catherine listened, frozen, as he finished the memory, how she woke that morning with sunlight on her cheek and the scent of roses still on her skin, expecting a knock, a message, anything, only to find nothing but silence, as if the night had been a dream she was not allowed to keep. Adrian's voice tightened on the last line, and when he spoke again it sounded like a confession meant to hurt himself as much as to inform her. "I intended to return within a week," he said. "It took me 10 years. Catherine's lips parted as if she might speak, but nothing came out at first. Her throat felt too tight for sound, and when she finally managed words, they came small and broken. "You never came back," she said, and it was not an accusation so much as a wounded fact she had repeated to herself for a decade. Adrian did not argue. He looked as though those 4 words had lived under his ribs all this time, pressing until they bruised. He told her that when he arrived in London in 1813, grief was only the beginning of what swallowed him. The dukedom was not a graceful inheritance, it was a machine that had been running poorly for years. There were debts his brother had hidden, repairs postponed until roofs leaked and tenants complained, legal disputes with neighbouring landowners, and obligations to powerful men who expected favours because they had once done favours for a Blackwood. Adrian's mother, the Dowager Duchess Margaret, was shattered by the loss of her eldest, and the household moved like a funeral procession for months. Adrian, barely past boyhood in his own mind, became the figure everyone stared at for stability. He admitted that in those first weeks he wrote letters in his head to Catherine every night, explanations, apologies, promises, and planned to return to Rosewood as soon as the immediate duties allowed. But reality turned cruelly complicated. He learned, through the same network of solicitors and stewards that managed great estates, that the Earl of Rosewood, Catherine's father, was ill and that Rosewood's finances were failing, and if the Duke suddenly appeared to court the Earl's daughter after having been on the estate under a false name, society would not read it as romance. They would read it as strategy, not his strategy but hers. They would whisper that Catherine had trapped a powerful man to save a dying estate, and if the truth came out, that he had hidden his identity, that he had met her in the servants' world, that he had taken liberties in the garden, she would not be the only one ruined. Adrian said he could have borne scandal for himself, but he could not bear it for her, not when she had trusted him without knowing what he was. He told himself he would wait a few months, stabilize Thornwick, settle the worst debts, then return properly under his true name with an offer so respectable no one could question it. Just a few months, he said, and Catherine heard the bitterness in his voice because he knew how foolish that sounded now. Months became years the way snow becomes a drift, quietly, steadily, until you look up and realize you are trapped. Every time he prepared to go, another crisis rose, a tenant uprising after a harsh winter, a lawsuit that required his presence, political pressure from London that demanded a duke's signature, his mother's fragile health, and beneath all of it fear that Catherine would see only a liar, fear that she would hate him, fear that he had already destroyed her peace and did not deserve to ask for a second chance. Meanwhile, Catherine told him, the other side of the decade was not filled with grand obstacles, it was filled with silence and shame. She waited for Adrian Clark as if waiting could undo what had happened, waking each morning thinking perhaps today there would be a note, a meeting, a promise kept, until days turned to weeks and absence grew louder than rejection. She searched quietly, asking careful questions of servants without revealing why, only to learn the young estate manager had left abruptly, no forwarding address, no farewell, no explanation, and as time stretched, the secret romance rotted into something uglier, that she had been foolish, used, convenient in a dark garden and then discarded. She lived in terror of exposure, of one careless remark destroying what little standing she had left, and when her father died within the year, grief piled on grief until the world felt sealed and airless. With the estate in settlement and her circumstances uncertain, she withdrew, becoming companion to her Aunt Millicent, not for drama, but survival, respectable enough to avoid questions, small enough to be invisible, telling herself she deserved exile. Adrian listened, jaw tight, and then admitted what he had never meant to admit on their wedding night: he had not truly lost track of her. After 2 years, when guilt became unbearable, he hired discreet investigators who asked questions without raising alarms, learning she had not married, had not taken a lover, had not been caught in scandal, that she had grown quiet and withdrawn, knowledge that both relieved and broke him because it meant she had carried loneliness alone. He sent money anonymously through legal channels that looked like routine settlements, ensuring Catherine would not suffer hardship, ensuring her aunt could keep a decent home, ensuring Catherine was protected from poverty's worst edges without ever knowing a hand had reached out, instructing solicitors in writing that Miss Hartley must never be told, because he did not want her to feel purchased, indebted, or watched, though he was watching, he admitted, from the shadows, believing he had forfeited the right to step into her life openly. Years passed and the memory of that night did not fade but sharpened, Catherine becoming both a real woman somewhere in England and a wound he could not close, until learning she was still unmarried at 27, still a companion, still at the edge of society, snapped something in him from waiting into action. He chose now or never, not because time had made him brave but because it had made him desperate, orchestrating an invitation to Lord Ashford's house party with quiet ducal influence so Millicent would be invited and Catherine compelled to attend, planning their meeting to look like chance because he feared that truth at her door would make her slam it shut. 3 weeks ago, he said quietly, I saw you again, Catherine, standing beside your aunt with your hands folded like you were trying to take up as little space as possible, and you looked at me like I was a stranger, and Catherine's breath caught because that much was undeniable. Adrian's eyes held hers, steady and haunted, as he finished, you didn't recognize me, but I recognized you the moment you lifted your chin. Catherine's shock hardened into anger that felt almost clean compared to shame, because anger at least gave her spine, and she stared at Adrian as if seeing him properly for the first time. You planned our meeting, she demanded, the words sharp in the quiet room. Adrian did not pretend innocence, he only nodded once, as if accepting the strike. He told her how the house party at Lord Ashford's estate had been selected with care, an event fashionable enough to draw the right guests, but small enough that he could speak to her without an audience pressing close. Catherine remembered arriving with Aunt Millicent, feeling like an outsider among polished ladies and confident men, wearing a dress chosen for propriety rather than beauty, telling herself she was only there to pour tea, to hold shawls, to be useful. She remembered the moment the butler announced the Duke of Thornwick and how the room seemed to straighten around him. She had looked up and seen a man older than the one in her memories, broader in shoulder, harder in expression, his features sharpened by time, and yes, a beard then that changed the shape of his face. Nothing in her mind had reached back 10 years to connect him to the half-seen stranger in a summer garden. A duke belonged to a different universe. Adrian told her that he watched her that first evening from across the drawing room, not because he wished to stalk her, but because he needed to know if she still existed as a person, not just a memory he had polished in guilt. He saw her quietness, her careful manners, the way she let other people speak over her as if she had learned to disappear, and it made him both protective and sick with self-blame. So he sought her out. He made excuses that sounded casual, asking her opinion of the library's collection, commenting on the architecture, praising a renovation she had noticed, and Catherine, in her own memory, felt again that strange confusion. Why would a duke speak to her at all when she was merely a poor companion? Yet he did, repeatedly, with an intensity that unsettled her. He asked what she read, and listened as though her answers mattered. He asked about estate management in a way that made her suspect he actually cared about tenants and roofs and grain yields, not just hunting and politics. He spoke of land as responsibility rather than possession, and Catherine had found herself answering more honestly than she intended, surprised to discover she had opinions after so many years of keeping them tucked away. Still, his attention frightened her. It did not feel like flirtation, not like the playful games she had seen rich men play with pretty women. It felt focused, almost urgent, as if he were trying to solve a problem only he could see. Aunt Millicent, practical and anxious about their future, noticed his interest and encouraged it in the only way a woman of limited power could, by praising Catherine's usefulness, by placing her near him at dinner, by urging her to accept walks where chaperones lagged a little too far behind. Catherine admitted she had not resisted as she should have, because the Duke's attention felt like sunlight after a long winter, and because security is a powerful seduction when you have lived in uncertainty. Adrian told her he did not offer himself slowly. He had waited 10 years, he could not wait another season. 3 weeks after their first conversation, he proposed. Catherine remembered that moment with painful clarity, the formal words, the heavy ring, the shock of the room, Aunt Millicent's trembling relief, and her own heart dropping as if she had stepped into deep water. She had told herself she was being sensible. A duke's offer was not something one refused lightly, and for a woman with little money and a scandalous secret buried in her past, it felt like a lifeline she might never see again. She said yes, but she said yes with a plan. She would confess after the wedding, before their marriage became physical, because she would not trap him in ignorance. That was why she had spoken tonight. That was why her stomach turned now as she realized how different the truth was. "I didn't have a real choice," she said, voice shaking with fury. "You arranged the setting. You arranged the invitation. You made yourself the only answer to my problems." Adrian's brows drew together. "You could have refused me," he said, and Catherine heard the sincerity, but it did not soothe her. "Could I?" she shot back. "When you are a duke and I am a companion. When my aunt's future depends on my obedience. When you place me in a room designed to make me grateful." Adrian's face tightened as if each word cut, yet he did not deny the imbalance. He only said, "I wanted to give you a life where you never had to be afraid again." Catherine's laugh was bitter. "And did you ever ask if I wanted that life from you?" Silence followed, thick and dangerous. Then Adrian spoke again, quieter, and the vulnerability in his voice startled her more than any command. "Catherine," he said, "that night in the garden, you were my first as well." The words struck her like a slap because they overturned another assumption she had carried, that men of his rank moved through women like through rooms, untouched by consequence. "You expect me to believe a duke reached 32 untouched?" she asked, and despite herself she searched his face for mockery. There was none. He looked almost pained. "I was not always a duke," he reminded her. "And after that night, I could not," he stopped, as if the admission cost him pride. "I tried," he said at last, blunt with honesty. "I tried to forget you in the way men are expected to forget. It did not work. Every time I thought of taking someone else to my bed, I remembered the way you looked at the stars and asked questions as if the world might answer. I remember the way you touched me like I was human, not important. You haunted me," he said, the word raw. "Not because you ruined me, Catherine, but because you showed me what it felt like to be known, and then I lost you." Catherine's anger faltered for one unsteady moment, replaced by a confusing ache, because she heard truth in him even while she hated how he had handled it. Adrian stepped closer, careful, as though approaching an injured animal. "I am not proud of how I brought you back into my life," he said. "I am proud of wanting you, and I am proud of marrying you, but I am not proud of the manipulation." Catherine's hands curled into fists. "So what am I to you?" she demanded. "A wife? A debt you intend to pay? A memory you refuse to release?" Adrian's gaze held hers, and in it she saw fear, real fear, not of scandal, but of losing her again. "You are the woman I have loved for 10 years, he said, then paused as if correcting himself with effort. "And you are the woman I am trying to learn how to love properly now." Catherine's breath came shallow, her thoughts racing, because part of her wanted to believe him and part of her wanted to run. Adrian's voice dropped even lower, and the next words landed like the first beat of a new storm. "But there is something else you need to know," he said, and the weight of that sentence told her the night was not done breaking open yet. Morning came too quickly, as if the night had never happened and yet everything had changed, and Catherine sat at the breakfast table with a cup of tea growing cold between her hands while the great house moved around her in smooth, practiced silence. The servants at Thornwick Manor were flawless, quiet footsteps, lowered eyes, trays placed without a sound, yet Catherine felt as if the walls themselves were listening. She had not slept in Adrian's bed. When the candles burned down and the weight of his confession pressed too hard, she had asked for the adjoining chamber, and Adrian, after a long pause, had agreed without argument, only saying in a voice that tried to stay steady, "You will have whatever space you require." At breakfast they spoke little, the conversation stiff and careful, as if any wrong word might bring the whole truth crashing back down. Adrian looked drawn, as though he had been awake all night, but he kept his manners, asked if she had rested, and then was called away on estate business before she could decide whether she wanted him to stay or leave. The moment he was gone, Catherine felt a restless need to move, to do something besides sit inside her own thoughts. Thornwick was enormous, and in the first weeks of marriage she had seen only the proper rooms, the drawing room, the dining room, the formal halls where portraits of dead Blackwoods watched from gilded frames. Now, alone, she wandered with slow steps, telling herself she was only learning her home, only acquainting herself with the place she was expected to rule as Duchess. The corridors smelled faintly of Polish and old stone, and winter lights slanted through tall windows in pale sheets. As she turned a corner near the grand staircase, she noticed a door that seemed slightly different from the rest, heavier, darker, and, most telling, locked, and a small prickle of curiosity ran through her. Great houses always had closed rooms, wings reserved for storage or grief, but Catherine had the unsettling sense that this lock was not about dust or disuse, it was about secrecy. She hesitated only a moment before calling for a footman and asking, in as calm a voice as she could manage, what lay beyond. The young man looked uncomfortable and said, "The east wing, Your Grace," then added quickly, "It is kept closed." Catherine pressed politely but firmly, and he confessed he did not have the key. That should have ended the matter, but Catherine was no longer in the mood to be proper, not after learning her husband had built their marriage on years of hidden choices. She waited until the footman left, then sought out a small sewing basket in her sitting room where pins and slender tools were kept, because 10 years of surviving quietly had taught her how to be resourceful when she had no power in obvious ways. The lock was old, the mechanism worn, and after several tense minutes the door gave with a soft click that sounded, to her ears, like a confession. The air beyond was cooler and smelled of dust and closed curtains. Catherine stepped inside and shut the door behind her, feeling both foolish and determined. The east wing was dim, the windows covered, furniture draped in Holland cloth like sleeping ghosts, her footsteps echoing softly on the wooden floor as every sound seemed louder in the stillness. She moved room to room, pushing aside covers just enough to see outlines, chairs, a pianoforte, a writing desk, objects abandoned, not broken, simply hidden away, until in a room at the far end she saw a shape against the wall that made her stop so abruptly her breath caught. A large portrait stood there, not hanging proudly but placed as if private, almost guarded, covered by a cloth pulled back just enough to reveal a corner of painted white. Her hand shook as she crossed the room, already knowing this was not a Blackwood ancestor, and when she drew the cloth aside fully the world seemed to tilt. It was her, not as she was now, but at 17, in white muslin with blue ribbons, her hair softer, her eyes bright with a hope she had not allowed herself in years. The detail was astonishing, the flush of her cheeks, the shape of her mouth as if about to speak, intimate rather than formal, as if the painter had loved the subject, and at the base of the frame fresh winter flowers had been arranged with care, as though the portrait were visited, not stored. Catherine's pulse hammered. How? Then how long? And she stood frozen until a soft voice behind her said, "His Grace comes here often, my lady." She spun to find an older maid with kind eyes who introduced herself as Rosa and explained she attended the private rooms. Catherine asked how long it had been there, and Rosa replied that it had been painted years ago, 2 years after that summer at Rosewood, brought wrapped like treasure and never spoken of. Catherine's skin went cold, anger flaring and tangling with something dangerously like tenderness as Rosa added that Adrian placed fresh flowers every week, even when away, never forgetting. Catherine swallowed, staring at the girl in the painting, then asked if there was anything else, and Rosa hesitated before mentioning a desk whose drawers were never dusted. Catherine approached it, lifted the cloth, and after a long struggle opened the locked drawer to find bundles of letters and documents, solicitors' correspondence, instructions in Adrian's hand, sums of money, discreet inquiries about Miss Hartley's circumstances, and again the line that twisted her stomach, "Miss Hartley must never know." There were records of help she had never understood, anonymous payments, quiet protections, a life shaped from the shadows, and her hands trembled as gratitude and fury collided inside her. She raised a hand for silence when Rosa shifted, stared at the portrait and the flowers and the drawer of evidence, and wondered whether this was love or obsession, devotion or control. She was still standing there when the door opened with a decisive click and Adrian's voice filled the room, low and strained, saying her name as if he had always known this moment would come, and when she turned to face him, papers in hand, she asked steadily, "How do I know what's real, the memory you've worshipped for 10 years, or me?" Adrian stood in the doorway of the closed east wing like a man caught between shame and pride, and for a long moment neither of them moved. Catherine held his papers in her shaking hands, and he looked at them as if they were pieces of his own exposed heart. He did not snatch them away, did not command her to stop, and that restraint only made her angrier, because it felt like one more careful choice he was making on her behalf. "You had no right," she said, voice low but fierce, and Adrian's jaw tightened as he nodded once, accepting the blow. "No," he admitted. "I did not." He took a slow step forward, eyes flicking to the portrait with the fresh flowers, then back to her face. "I wanted to keep you safe," he said, and Catherine almost laughed at how often men used that phrase to excuse anything. "Safe from what?" she snapped. "From hunger? From gossip? Or from your own guilt?" Adrian's expression pinched, and for a moment he looked less like a duke and more like the young man he claimed to have been, frightened of doing the wrong thing and doing it anyway. "From the world," he said, then corrected himself with a quiet honesty that surprised her. "And from myself." Before Catherine could answer, footsteps approached from the corridor and a butler's voice called Adrian's name with formal urgency. Adrian's gaze hardened into duty in the way she was beginning to recognize, and he said, "We must speak later, properly," as if properly could fix what had already been done. Catherine watched him leave, papers still in her hands, feeling both powerful and sick. Later that afternoon the house shifted into a new kind of tension, the kind that arrives with a high-ranking visitor, and when Catherine entered the front drawing room she found the Dowager Duchess Margaret already seated as if she had been born into that chair. Margaret Blackwood was elegant in a cold way, her grey hair pinned precisely, her dress severe and expensive, her expression composed like marble. She rose just enough to satisfy courtesy, kissed Catherine's cheek with perfumed distance, and said, "So, you are the Duchess of Thornwick." The word sounded less like welcome and more like assessment. Catherine forced a polite smile. "Yes, Your Grace," she replied, remembering that a dowager remained Your Grace as well, a reminder that there could be more than one duchess in a house, and the older one often had sharper teeth. Tea was brought in, and the conversation began with the usual topics: weather, travel time, the health of mutual acquaintances, yet every sentence felt like a blade wrapped in silk. Margaret's eyes moved over Catherine's face and hands as if searching for flaws. 3 weeks is a remarkably brief courtship, she remarked, stirring her tea slowly. "One would almost think my son was in a hurry." Catherine felt heat rise in her cheeks. "His Grace made his intentions clear," she said carefully. Margaret's gaze sharpened. "Did he?" she asked, and the question carried a strange weight, as though she suspected more than she said. Adrian entered then, and the temperature of the room changed at once. He kissed his mother's hand with duty, then stood closer to Catherine than before, not touching her, but clearly placing himself between them. Margaret's mouth tightened at the sight. "Adrian," she said, "I do hope you have not acted out of impulsive sentiment." Adrian's voice was controlled. "I acted out of certainty," he replied. Margaret sipped her tea. "Certainty can be misguided," she said, then looked at Catherine. "And new duchesses sometimes misunderstand what is expected of them." Catherine's fingers tightened around her teacup, but she kept her posture. "I understand expectations very well," she answered. Adrian's gaze flickered to her, as if he heard both her pride and the trembling beneath it. Margaret offered a thin smile. "Good," she said. "Because Thornwick is not a place for improvisation." The word landed like a warning. Catherine wondered, with a sick twist in her stomach, how much Margaret knew about Rosewood, about the false name, about the way the marriage had been arranged like a trap lined with velvet, or whether she was simply a mother who disliked surprises and distrusted any woman who entered her son's life too quickly. When the dowager finally left, Catherine's restraint snapped the moment the door closed behind her. "Does everyone in your world speak in threats?" she demanded, turning on Adrian. "Or is it only reserved for women who marry into your family?" Adrian's face tightened. "My mother is protective," he said. That is all." Catherine's laugh was sharp. "Protective of whom?" she asked. "Of you? Or of your reputation?" Adrian took a breath, and she saw the urge in him to smooth things over with authority, to decide what the problem was and solve it. He stopped himself, and that effort almost mattered, almost. "She does not know what you think she knows," he said, though Catherine was not sure if he meant it as reassurance or denial. "Then why do I feel like she does?" Catherine shot back. She barely had time to gather herself before another visitor was announced, Lady Beatrice Ashford. Catherine's stomach tightened at the name because she knew it from the house party, knew it from the way other women had watched Beatrice, beautiful, confident, a widow with money and connections, a woman who moved through society like she owned the air. Beatrice entered in a sweep of fashionable fabric and practiced charm, kissed Catherine's cheek as if they were friends, and said with a bright smile, "I simply had to call on our newest Duchess." Adrian appeared again, drawn by the sound of her voice, and for the briefest moment Beatrice's eyes flashed with something sharper than friendliness. "Your Grace," she said to Adrian, curtsying with a grace that felt like a performance. Adrian's reply was polite, distant, and Catherine noticed it, noticed how carefully he gave Beatrice nothing. They took seats, and Beatrice began with compliments about the manor, Catherine's taste, Catherine's good fortune, each phrase sweet enough to be insulting if you listened closely. Then, as if dropping a teacup on purpose just to hear it shatter, Beatrice said, "It was quite the surprise, you know. I had always assumed the Thornwick and Ashford families would be joined." Catherine's pulse jumped. "I beg your pardon," she asked. Beatrice smiled. "Oh, nothing official," she said lightly, "just an understanding, as these things go. A possibility everyone expected to ripen into a plan." Her eye slid to Adrian. "Until 3 weeks ago, of course, when His Grace became very determined to marry someone else." Catherine's mouth went dry. Adrian's expression went blank. "Lady Beatrice," he said, warning in his tone. Beatrice lifted a hand. "Forgive me," she said, still smiling, "but I do hate confusion. And I hate watching a woman walk into something without knowing the full shape of it." Catherine's heart hammered. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, voice steady only by force. Beatrice leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing friendly advice. "I'm suggesting," she said, "that you should ask your husband how long he has been looking for you. Men like Adrian do not stumble into decisions. They pursue them." Catherine's skin prickled because it was true, everything about Adrian felt deliberate. Beatrice's eyes sharpened with a mix of jealousy and satisfaction. "Ask him how many people he employed to find you," she murmured. "Ask him what he promised and to whom. Ask him whether you are a wife or a prized possession he finally reclaimed." Adrian stood abruptly. "Enough," he said, cold now. Beatrice rose as well, perfectly composed. "Of course," she replied, her smile turning faintly pitying toward Catherine. "I only wish to spare you pain later. Good day, Duchess." When she left, the room felt smaller, tighter, as if her words had stolen the air. Catherine turned to Adrian, and for the first time the fear in her was louder than her anger, because Beatrice had placed language on what Catherine had been struggling to name, love that looked like control, devotion that looked like ownership. "Tell me the truth," Catherine said, stepping back as if distance might protect her. "Did you arrange the house party invitation? Did you arrange my aunt's attendance? How many investigators did you hire? How long have you been watching me from the shadows?" Adrian's face tightened, and the silence that followed was not denial, it was the pause of a man deciding how much truth to give. Catherine felt her stomach drop because she already sensed the answer would hurt. "I need the truth, Adrian," she said, voice shaking but firm, "all of it, or I'm leaving." Catherine stood very straight, as if posture could hold her together when her inside felt like breaking glass, and she did not sit even when Adrian gestured toward a chair, because sitting felt too much like surrender. "Was any of it real?" she demanded, her voice quiet but sharp enough to cut. Adrian's face tightened, and he looked for a moment as though he might try to smooth this over with calm words, but then he seemed to understand that calm would only insult her now. "Yes," he said carefully. "It was real." Catherine's laugh was short and bitter. "That is not an answer," she said. "Did you arrange Lord Ashford's invitation? Yes or no?" Adrian held her gaze. "Yes," he admitted, and the single word landed like a slap. Catherine's throat went tight. "How?" she pressed. "You bribed him? You threatened him? You used your influence like a weapon?" Adrian's jaw flexed. "I used influence," he said, not trying to dress it up. "I asked for a house party. I made it worth his while. No threats." Catherine's hands curled into fists. "And my aunt?" she demanded. "Did you pay her to push me into your arms?" Adrian's eyes flashed with something like hurt pride. "No," he said firmly. "I did not pay Millicent. I would not buy you from your own family." Catherine's voice rose. "But you ensured she came," she said. "You guided her like a piece on a chessboard." Adrian hesitated just long enough to confirm it, then said, "Yes. I made sure she received the invitation. I made sure it appealed to her. I made sure you would be there." Catherine's stomach turned, because each confession stripped away another layer of the story she had told herself, the story where fate had simply delivered a duke to a lonely woman and offered rescue. "And the investigators," she said, forcing her words steady. "How many? How long?" Adrian's shoulders lowered slightly, as if he were laying down weapons. "Enough to find you," he said. "Enough to ensure you were safe. I began with one man, then used others as needed. I stopped when I had clear information. I never wanted you to feel hunted." Catherine stared at him. "But I was hunted," she said. "You followed my life without my knowledge. You funded my aunt's household without my consent. You built a cage lined with silk and called it protection." Adrian flinched at that, the first visible crack in his control. "I did it because I failed you once," he said, voice roughening. "Because I left you in that garden with nothing but my promise, and I broke it. I could not bear to fail you again." Catherine's eyes stung, and anger rose like heat, because his guilt was not her burden to carry. "So you married me to ease your conscience," she said. Adrian's expression sharpened. "No," he said hard. "I married you because I have loved you for 10 years. Catherine stepped back as if the sentence had pushed her. "You loved a memory," she replied. "A girl in white muslin and blue ribbons who did not know your name. That girl is not me." Adrian swallowed. "You are her," he insisted. "And you are more." Catherine shook her head. "You do not even know what amorth is," she said, her voice trembling now. "You do not know what 10 years did to me. You do not know what it is to wake every morning and measure your words so no one guesses your shame. You do not know what it is to watch life go on while you stand still, because you are afraid one wrong step will ruin you." Adrian's face tightened with pain. "I know I caused it," he said quietly. Catherine's eyes flashed. "And yet you caused it again," she said. "You took my life, which was already small, and you rearranged it without asking. You decided I would meet you. You decided I would be impressed. You decided I would accept." Adrian lifted his hands slightly, palms open. "I never forced you," he said. "I did not put a gun to your head. I did not threaten your aunt. You could have refused." Catherine's voice went cold. "You do not understand power," she said. "You were born into it. You breathe it like air. You think choice exists the same way for everyone, but it does not. When a duke pursues, the world tilts. When a duke proposes, people expect gratitude, not thought." Adrian's eyes held hers, and for a second the Duke fell away and there was only a man frightened of himself. "Then tell me what you wanted," he said quietly. "Tell me what you wanted, Catherine, and I will listen." Catherine's breath hitched, because she realized with sudden, terrible clarity that she had not asked herself that question in years. Wanting had felt dangerous, so she had lived on duty and survival and quiet endurance. "I wanted to be seen," she said. "Not watched. Seen. I wanted someone to look at me and ask, truly ask, who I am. I wanted a partner, not a protector. I wanted a husband who does not arrange my life like an estate account." Adrian's face crumpled for an instant before he gathered it back. "I did not know how to love you without trying to protect you," he admitted. "Every time I imagined losing you again, I panicked. I thought if I controlled the circumstances, I could keep you safe. I thought if I made everything perfect, you would stay." Catherine did not soften. "Protection isn't control," she said. "And love isn't possession." Adrian's breathing grew heavier. "What do you want from me?" he asked. Catherine thought of the portrait in the locked wing and knew that if she stayed unchanged she would spend her life competing with her own ghost. "I want space," she said. "I am going to London." Adrian froze. "London," he repeated. "People will talk." "Let them," Catherine said. "They have talked about me for 10 years in my own mind." Adrian's eyes shone. "If you go, I don't know if you will come back." Catherine steadied herself. "Then make yourself the kind of man I can come back to," she said. "Not a duke who arranges, but a husband who asks." Adrian nodded once. "I will not stop you," he said, restraint turning pain into discipline. Catherine turned away, walked out of the closed wing, and felt every step like a tear in cloth, knowing that by nightfall she would be alone in London, in a marriage cracked open into a war for her own agency, uncertain whether the next letter from Adrian would be an apology, a command, or nothing at all. 2 weeks passed in a strange, sharp new rhythm, and Catherine discovered that distance could feel both lonely and liberating at the same time. In the Thornwick London townhouse, she woke each morning with no one watching her choices, no one quietly correcting her path, and that alone made her breathe deeper. The house was elegant but less intimidating than Thornwick Manor, with rooms that felt more human than monumental, and for the first time in years she had a title that opened doors instead of closing them. At first she stayed inside, telling herself she needed rest, but the truth was she was afraid that stepping into society would invite whispers, afraid that leaving the house would make her a target, afraid that she would prove to everyone that she did not belong as a duchess. Then she remembered her own words to Adrian, she was done letting fear decide her life. So she began small. She visited a bookseller on Bond Street with a footman a few paces behind, bought volumes she actually wanted instead of what was considered proper, and felt a surprising thrill when the shopkeeper bowed lower than usual because of her rank. She attended a morning music-hall with her head held high, even when she saw curious glances flick in her direction. She discovered that being a duchess did not mean she had to be silent, it meant people listened when she spoke. In one drawing room she met Lady Margot Sinclair, a witty widow in her 30s with clear eyes and an easy confidence that Catherine envied at once. Margot spoke to her without flattery and without fear, as if Catherine were simply another woman, and that normalcy felt like kindness. Over tea, Margot asked one direct question: "Are you hiding in London, or are you living here?" And Catherine, startled by how accurate it was, admitted she did not know. Margot's laugh was soft but not cruel. "Most courtships have maneuvering," she said. "Families arrange meetings. Friends hint. Men position themselves. Society is a chessboard whether we like it or not. But there is a difference between maneuvering and control. Love requires two whole people, not one person's obsession and the other person's compliance." Catherine felt the word settle into her like truth. She began seeing Margot more often, not as a dependent seeking approval but as a woman learning her own voice. Margot encouraged her to speak plainly in conversation, to state opinions about books and politics and charity without immediately apologizing, and Catherine found, to her shock, that she had opinions, strong ones, that had been waiting for permission to exist. She toured a small charity school, offered funds in her own name, and realized she liked deciding where money went, liked the feeling of action rather than hiding. Yet in quieter moments, when the house settled and candles burned low, her thoughts returned to Adrian like a bruise you cannot stop touching. She remembered his face when she said she was leaving, the discipline, the pain, the way he let her go. She told herself she should feel only anger, but she did not. She felt a complicated pull, the recognition of a man who had truly been haunted, and the uneasy possibility that she might love him even while refusing the version of him that tried to manage her. Meanwhile, at Thornwick, Adrian worked as if Labour could punish him into becoming better. He rose before dawn, rode the estate boundaries in bitter cold, reviewed tenant ledgers, argued with stewards, and took meetings until late evening, then sat alone in his study staring at paper he could not bring himself to sign. He visited the closed east wing more than once, stood before Catherine's portrait, and for the first time understood the ugliness of what he had done by turning memory into something locked and owned. He wrote letters to Catherine every night, pages of apology, honesty, regret, even small details about his day meant to sound human instead of ducal, but he never sent them. Each time he sealed one, he imagined it arriving like a command, like another attempt to pull her back before she chose, so he tore the seal open again and hid the letter in a drawer. Lord Edmund Trace, his closest friend, arrived without warning one bleak afternoon and found Adrian in his study looking like a man who had not slept properly in weeks. Edmund did not offer comfort first, he offered truth. "You collected her," Edmund said, blunt as a hammer. "Like that portrait. Like an heirloom you lost and couldn't stop polishing in your mind." Adrian's eyes flashed with anger, then fell. "I loved her," he said. Edmund's reply was immediate. "You loved her, yes," he agreed. "But you also feared her choices, so you tried to remove them. That isn't love at its best, Adrian. It's love mixed with possession." Adrian's throat tightened, and for a moment he looked like he might argue, but the fight drained out of him because deep down he knew Edmund was right. "I thought if I set the stage perfectly, she would feel safe," Adrian admitted, voice rough. Edmund shook his head. "Safety isn't the same as agency," he said. "If you want her back, you cannot win her like a negotiation. You need to let her choose you, or not the Duke, not the title, not the comfort. You, the man." That sentence lodged in Adrian's chest like a hard seed. Over the next days he began to change in small, painful ways. He ordered the east wing opened and cleaned so it would no longer feel like a shrine. He instructed his solicitors to end the secret financial arrangements that had kept Catherine's life under his hidden hand, and he began drafting a letter that did not plead and did not command, only acknowledged wrongdoing and offered choice. And while both of them struggled toward growth on separate sides of England, Lady Beatrice Ashford began her own campaign in London, smiling sweetly as she planted poison. The whispers started quietly at first. How did a poor companion secure a duke in 3 weeks? What inducement could possibly move a man like Thornwick so fast? What secrets did the new Duchess carry under her modest manners? And then the whispers spread, fed by curiosity and envy. Invitations Catherine expected did not arrive. A woman who had smiled at her one day turned cool the next. Aunt Millicent sent anxious notes begging Catherine to come home and settle things before they became dangerous. Catherine tried to ignore it, telling herself she had survived worse than gossip, but the tension crept into every room she entered, and one evening, when Margot arrived with an expression that was unusually serious, Catherine's stomach dropped before a word was spoken. "You need to hear this from me," Margot said quietly, taking Catherine's hands. "The rumors are turning sharper." Catherine's pulse raced. "Rumors about what?" she asked, though part of her already knew. Margot hesitated only a moment before answering, "About your past," and in that instant Catherine understood she was about to face the very scandal she had spent 10 years running from, only now she would have to decide whether to hide again, or stand in full view and refuse to be shamed. The rumors did not stay contained, they spread like ink in water, faint at first and then impossible to ignore, and Catherine learned quickly that society could punish without ever making a direct accusation. No one said, "The Duchess of Thornwick is ruined," at least not in public, but she saw it in the small cruelties, the pause before a hostess greeted her, the sudden need to rearrange seating, the invitations that stopped arriving, the smiles that turned brittle, the way women she barely knew looked at her with open curiosity as if she were a story rather than a person. Beatrice's influence was everywhere, gentle as perfume and just as suffocating, and the most damaging part was that the whispers carried the shape of truth without details, insinuations that Catherine had done something improper long ago, that she had caught a duke too quickly, that her modesty was a disguise. Aunt Millicent grew frantic, wringing her hands in the townhouse sitting room, begging Catherine to write to Adrian and demand he crush the gossip with his power, insisting he could silence them with a word, but Catherine felt the old instinct to fold herself small and let a stronger person handle it, and that instinct tasted bitter now. If Adrian fixed everything, she would become exactly what she feared, a woman managed and protected, her reputation saved by a man's authority while her own agency remained untested. "No," Catherine said firmly. "I've hidden from society for 10 years. I will not hide again." Millicent whispered, "But what if they destroy you?" And Catherine replied, voice shaking but steady, "Then at least I will be standing when it happens." Lady Margot supported her immediately, explaining that society expected women to disappear so stories could harden into truth, and Catherine lifted her chin and said she would not vanish. When an invitation arrived for Lady Rothschild's grand ball, Catherine knew the moment had come and chose to attend on her own terms, not as a rescued wife but as a duchess who could stand alone. That night she dressed deliberately in sapphire, neither pleading nor apologetic, and entered the carriage with Margot, hands trembling but spine straight. Elsewhere in London, Adrian learned of the rumors and felt the old urge to crush anyone who threatened Catherine, pacing like a caged animal until Edmund Trace warned him that rescuing her would only prove her point, that trust meant surrender, and in the end Adrian chose to attend the ball without leading, ready to shield but not to command. At Lady Rothschild's townhouse the ballroom blazed with light, and when Catherine entered on Margot's arm the room paused, heads turning, whispers rising, but she walked on, greeting the hostess with perfect manners and standing alone amid quiet exile. Then Lady Beatrice appeared, radiant and cruel, drawing attention as she questioned Catherine publicly, her insinuations sharp and deliberate, laughter flickering at the edges as guests sensed spectacle. Catherine refused to shrink. She answered calmly that she caught her husband by being herself, that she would not apologize for her marriage or perform innocence for strangers, and the murmur that followed was mixed with shock and admiration. Margot spoke in support, and then the Dowager Duchess Margaret intervened coolly, chastising Beatrice, until tension stretched the room thin and the doors opened at the far end of the ballroom. Adrian entered with deliberate calm, crossed the floor without a word, ignored Beatrice entirely, and stopped before Catherine, and to the astonishment of everyone present, he went down on one knee before his wife, bowing his head as if she were the one with power, the gasp that rose around them marking the instant a story changed direction and everyone realized they were witnessing something irrevocable. For a heartbeat the ballroom seemed frozen, as if no one trusted their eyes, the Duke of Thornwick kneeling on the polished floor before his wife, not in jest, not in flirtation, but with a solemnity that made every whisper die on the spot. Catherine's pulse thundered in her ears, and she could only stare down at him, stunned by the reversal, this powerful man placing himself beneath her gaze, offering her the choice that had been missing from everything else. Adrian looked up, his expression open in a way she had not yet seen from him, and then he turned slightly so his voice would carry to the circle of onlookers. "You want to know how she caught me?" he asked, calm and clear, the question aimed not only at Beatrice but at the entire room hungry for scandal. "Then I will tell you." Beatrice's smile faltered, but she held her chin high, as if daring him to humiliate himself, and Adrian did not glance at her again. 10 years ago, he said, I met a young woman who spoke to me as though I were simply a man. Not a title. Not a fortune. A man. The room leaned in without meaning to, and Catherine felt her breath catch because she understood what he was doing, shaping truth into something that protected her while exposing himself. She was kind, Adrian continued, and clever, and brave enough to be honest when honesty cost her comfort. I have not forgotten that honesty for a single day. Murmurs rippled, surprised rather than cruel, and Adrian's voice strengthened. 3 weeks ago, I saw her again, and I knew I would not waste another year pretending I could live without her. So yes, I pursued her. I arranged to meet her. I begged her to marry me. A gasp rose, and Catherine felt her cheeks heat, not with shame but with astonishment at his willingness to stand bare before the very society that trained men like him never to appear vulnerable. If there is scandal, Adrian went on, it is not in my wife's character. It is in my own foolishness that a duke was lovesick enough to orchestrate his own courtship because he was afraid the woman he loved would slip away again. The room fell utterly silent. Catherine saw Lady Rothschild's fan stop mid-motion, saw women exchange startled looks no longer gleeful, saw men straighten as if forced to respect what they were hearing. Adrian turned back to Catherine, still kneeling, lowering his voice just enough that the intimacy struck her like a touch. I will not speak for you, he said. I will not decide for you. You can send me away here, in front of them all, and I will accept it. But I want them to know the truth before you choose. I chose you first. Catherine's throat tightened, and for a moment she could not speak. This was what she had demanded, agency, choice, truth, and he was offering it publicly, where he could not quietly undo her decision later. She took in the faces around them, Margot's steady encouragement, the dowager's watchful stillness, Beatrice's tightening expression as she realized control of the narrative was slipping away, then looked down at Adrian again and saw not the Duke who arranged things in secret, but a man risking his pride to give her power. Her hands trembled as she considered her choices, then she inhaled slowly and reached down to take Adrian's hand, the simple touch feeling like a declaration. Stand up, she said softly, and when he rose she did not let go. She faced the room and spoke clearly, her voice steady enough to surprise even herself. Yes, my husband pursued me. And yes, I accepted him, not because I was desperate, and not because I was scheming, but because I am a woman with a mind, and I made a decision. A few people exhaled as if they had been holding their breath. Catherine turned back to Adrian, and something in her chest loosened, not into easy forgiveness but into the possibility of partnership. If he is a fool, she said, letting the faintest warmth touch her tone, then I suppose I am one as well. Adrian's eyes brightened. For you, he said quietly, and she leaned in and kissed him, brief, controlled, but real, setting off a ripple of shocked gasps followed by applause that grew as people hurried to align themselves with the winning version of the story. Beatrice's face tightened into pale fury, and Catherine felt a cold satisfaction that the humiliation intended for her had been returned by dignity instead of cruelty. As the music resumed and the tone of the room shifted from predatory to admiring, Catherine knew the real test lay beyond the ballroom, and later, when Margot created a discreet diversion, Adrian offered his arm without pressure and she took it, slipping with him into Lady Rothschild's winter garden where glass walls held back the cold and the noise softened into distance. Catherine stopped near a potted lemon tree, hands trembling now that the performance was over, and Adrian stood a careful distance away. She thanked him but warned that grand gestures were not enough, and when she asked whether he loved her or the girl he remembered, Adrian admitted he had loved a memory because it was all he had, then confessed how fear had turned protection into control. Catherine named the wound plainly, and Adrian apologized without excuse, for leaving, for watching instead of choosing honesty, for shaping her life without consent, for every time he chose for her instead of with her. Catherine felt tears burn, admitted her own failures, and when Adrian suggested they begin again, she laid down her terms: partnership, choice, strength allowed even when it frightened him. Adrian agreed without hesitation and asked in return to learn the woman she was now, not the girl he remembered. Catherine studied him, then nodded. Yes, she said. We start again. Properly. Adrian offered his hand like a man asking permission, Catherine placed hers in his, and when he asked if she would come home, she answered with quiet certainty, "Yes, but this time, I want to see your face in the light." And when he kissed her in the garden, it was not possession or performance, but a private promise, made where promises finally mattered. The return to Thornwick felt different from the first time Catherine had arrived as a bride, because now she was not being delivered into a life someone else had designed, she was walking into it with her eyes open and her will intact. When they reached the manor, the servants' quiet efficiency remained the same, but Catherine sensed a subtle shift in the air, as if the house itself had taken note of the change between Duke and Duchess. That night, the real wedding night, began not with fear and confession, but with conversation. In the private sitting room adjoining their bedchamber, Adrian poured a small glass of wine for each of them and then, instead of directing the evening, asked, "What do you want, Catherine?" The question, simple as it was, made her throat tighten because it was the question she had been denied and the question she had denied herself. "I want honesty," she said, then added, "and time." Adrian nodded, and they spoke, truly spoke, for the first time as partners. Adrian told her what he remembered from that summer night beyond the obvious, the way she had asked about the stars as if she expected them to answer, the way she laughed when he admitted he hated London's noise, the way her hand had trembled only once before she steadied herself and stepped forward anyway. Catherine told him what she remembered too, the feeling of being seen as a whole person, the startling tenderness of a man who asked permission, the sharp heartbreak of waking to silence. When emotion swelled, Adrian did not try to fix it with promises, he let it exist. When Catherine grew quiet, he did not fill the silence with control, he waited, giving her room to choose each step. And when she finally said, softly but clearly, "This time, I want to see your face," Adrian moved closer into the candlelight so she could. He looked nervous then, not powerful, and that nervousness eased something inside her. Their intimacy followed naturally from that honesty, tender, consensual, unhurried, more about closeness than conquest, until Catherine realized with a quiet astonishment that the fear she had carried for a decade was loosening at last, replaced by a feeling she had almost forgotten how to hold, safety that did not cost her autonomy. Later, as they lay together with the house silent around them, Adrian traced her ring lightly and murmured, "I love you," and Catherine answered, not as a dutiful wife but as a woman choosing her own truth, "I love you too, Adrian, not the Duke." In the weeks that followed, their life began to change in visible, practical ways. Catherine asked to see estate accounts, and instead of being amused or dismissive, Adrian brought the ledgers to the library and sat beside her. They argued at times, Catherine insisting on better repairs for tenant cottages, Adrian worrying about costs and timing, but the arguments ended in compromise rather than command. When Adrian's protectiveness flared, as it sometimes did, he caught himself and said, "What do you think we should do?" and Catherine learned to answer without shrinking. The servants noticed as well, the Duchess walking the grounds with confidence, the Duke listening more than speaking, the household feeling warmer, less like a machine and more like a home. Catherine began to host small gatherings not to prove herself but to create the kind of society she wanted, one where charity was not a performance and where young women were not treated like prey. One cold afternoon, while exploring an attic space with boxes of old papers, Catherine discovered something that stopped her breath, a bundle of letters tied with faded ribbon, addressed in Adrian's hand to the late Earl of Rosewood. Her fingers shook as she opened them, expecting more secrets, more evidence of manipulation, but instead she found something that softened her anger into a deeper understanding. The letters were dated just after the summer at Rosewood, and in them Adrian had written formally, asking permission to court Catherine properly, admitting he had met her during estate work and wished to approach with respect. Attached to the bundle was a returned notice from a solicitor, explaining the Earl was deceased and the estate in settlement, correspondence to be redirected. Adrian had tried to do it right, at least in that first frantic attempt, only to be blocked by death and chaos and distance. Catherine carried the letters downstairs with tears blurring her vision and found Adrian in his study. He looked up, startled by her expression, and she placed the bundle on his desk with trembling hands. "You wrote," she said, voice breaking. "You did try." Adrian stared at the letters as if they might burn him. I did, he whispered, and the shame in his face was different now, less defensive and more human. Catherine swallowed, forcing words through the tightness in her throat. We were both trapped, she said. By circumstances, by fear, by pride. Adrian's eyes shone. And by my cowardice, he added. Catherine shook her head. By my silence too, she said, surprising herself with the honesty. I hid instead of seeking help. I punished myself for what happened as if I were the only one who mattered. Adrian stood, moved around the desk, and took her hands gently. No more, he said. Catherine nodded, and together they carried the old letters to the hearth. They did not burn them in anger, they burned them as a symbol, a deliberate closing of a chapter they had both lived inside for too long. The paper curled and blackened, ash lifting softly into the air, and Catherine felt a strange peace settle in her chest. The past doesn't define us anymore, she said. Adrian squeezed her hands. We write the future, he replied. 1 year later, midsummer returned, and with it the anniversary of the night that had begun everything. Thornwick Manor was brighter now, fuller, with laughter rising through halls that had once felt heavy with silence. Catherine stood in the garden with a gentle curve to her belly, early enough that only those closest knew, but visible enough that Adrian's eyes kept flicking to her with quiet awe. That evening they hosted a servants' ball at Thornwick, not as nobles granting permission from a distance, but as a duke and duchess choosing to celebrate the people who made the estate a living place. There were lanterns in the trees, music on the lawn, ribbons tied to benches, and joy that did not feel staged. Adrian and Catherine danced openly among their household staff, not hiding behind false names or shadows, and Catherine felt the full-circle irony with a warm, tender laugh. Later, as the night deepened, they slipped away to the rose garden, where blooms were thick and the air smelled sweet, and the stars looked the same as they had 10 years before. Catherine rested a hand on her stomach and looked at Adrian with playful seriousness. "Do you remember?" she asked. Adrian's smile was softer than it had ever been in the early days of their marriage. "Every detail," he said, then added, "but I prefer our new version." Catherine's eyes warmed. "So do I," she admitted. They spoke quietly about the child coming, about plans for estate improvements Catherine wanted to lead, about what kind of home they wished to build, one shaped by two voices, not one. And when Catherine finally said, "I love you," Adrian answered without hesitation, "I love you," as if the words were no longer dangerous. Catherine's smile turned sly as she echoed the line that had once shattered her world and remade it into something lighter. "I know," she said softly. "You were there." Adrian laughed, real, unguarded, and pulled her into a kiss beneath the stars while the manor glowed behind them and music drifted across the lawn like a promise kept at last.